it's probably a good idea for us to reacquaint ourselves with exactly where we are in the story right now as we continue to work our way through the Old Testament, through the history, the story of the people of Israel and Judah. So we've come through the time of our kings. We had a united nation for a period of time, but after Solomon's son took over, the kingdom divided into the north and the south. And we've seen that both have continued to struggle. And in fact, the northern kingdom has been destroyed by this point in our story. They died. They went away in the year 721. It was the Assyrians who came and conquered them and led them away and scattered them across the empire. The kingdom of Judah, the smaller of the kingdoms, was saved from the Assyrians around the year 700. God miraculously intervened and the Assyrians had to go away. Isaiah and Micah had talked to us about those times and the challenges of those times and the lack of justice and the lack of worship and those sorts of things that were happening. And so that's sort of where we are, where we left off in this story. It was around the year 700 when Isaiah and Micah seemed to sort of pass off the scene, and that's where we find ourselves now telling the story over these next 100 years or so, what we're going to call the final days of Judah. So this tiny empire is going to come to an end as well, and we are reliant in part on our prophet friend Ezekiel, who will fill in some of the gaps for us during this time. But Judah, let's pull it back for just a minute and remind ourselves that we're in this final countdown, if you will. It's the final countdown. The clock is ticking on the kingdom of Judah. Hezekiah, we had mentioned him in conjunction with Isaiah. Hezekiah was the king who lived to see another day when he thought it was about to be the end. When he dies, his oldest son takes over. His oldest son, his name is Manasseh. Let me find it here for you on the slide, so in case you're actually trying to fill in the blank and want to know how to spell his name, there it is for you on that second bullet point. Manasseh is the oldest son of Hezekiah, and he becomes Judah's king, takes over when Hezekiah dies, about the year 698, and he rules for 55 years. He is Judah's longest serving king. Now, unfortunately, Manasseh is also characterized as Judah's worst king ever. In the history of Judah, Manasseh is the worst. Hezekiah, his dad, got good reviews. He listened to the prophet Isaiah. He tried to make some changes. He tried to trust Yahweh and brought Yahweh worship back into Jerusalem. Manasseh fell far from the tree. Manasseh is a terrible king by all accounts. He is a murderer. He apparently practiced child sacrifice. He was worshiping idols, and apparently one of the idols, the story around the idol was that child sacrifice was required, and Manasseh took one of his own children and sacrificed it to this foreign god. And certainly from the perspective of those who wrote the story, there is no worse abomination than to sacrifice your own child to an idol, to some unknown God. It just doesn't get any worse than that. And so, unfortunately, Israel's worst king, who promotes idol worship, who apparently gets rid of Yahweh worship, basically. The worst king is the longest serving king. And so for 50 plus years, Judah has Manasseh in charge. But Manasseh doesn't live forever. And if we fast forward just a little bit to his grandson, yes, we're skipping, we're not giving you all the names of all the kings here. You're welcome. The last of Judah's good kings, his name was Josiah. Josiah, Josiah, was Manasseh's grandson. He's considered the last of Judah's good kings. You can read about him in 2 Kings chapter 22. And in fact, for one of the weekly assignments, you got to read a little bit about some of the discoveries that are happening while Josiah is the king. Apparently, things in Jerusalem and Judah were not great when Josiah becomes the king, and he becomes king when he's just a boy. But as he ages, he begins to move Judah back in the direction of Yahweh worship. He's trying to get rid of some of the idols, doing some of those sorts of things. But then there's a discovery that's made in the temple, and we're not quite sure what the situation is, but it's described as a book of the Torah, a book of the law, is discovered apparently in the temple. It seems as if Josiah is trying to rededicate and re-cleanse the temple for the worship of Yahweh. Maybe has some cleanup crews working, and somebody maybe's in a back closet and finds this scroll. And they take it to the high priest, and he unrolls it and reads it and is like, oh no. And he takes it to Josiah, the king, and reads it to him. And Josiah's like, oh no, we are in terrible shape. Josiah's reaction seems to indicate that Judah has fallen far from the ideal that is depicted in this writing. It's not specified exactly what this book of the Torah is. Probably the majority of scholars believe that what Josiah found was an early copy of the book of Deuteronomy. So that's what I'm envisioning in the blank here, Deuteronomy, question mark. Maybe because some of the things that Josiah says and notes and the way that he responds and to the language of obedience and blessing and potential punishment for their disobedience seems to go along well with what winds up in the book of Deuteronomy. And so perhaps it's an indication that some of the stories are beginning to be written by this time. And there's even some speculation in some circles that back during the time of Hezekiah, back around 700, that maybe there was a move to begin to write some things down. And if I use my imagination, I can certainly envision a world where some scribes, some people begin to write down some of the teachings in Deuteronomy that have been passed down during the time of Hezekiah. But then Manasseh becomes king, and he wants nothing to do with them. And somebody throws a scroll into a back closet somewhere only to be discovered, 70 years later. And suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, we really need to try to put this into place. And so Josiah is seen as a good king because he reads the scroll, he wants to put it into practice, and it encourages his reform and moves the people in the direction of greater Yahweh worship. Well, it's about this time, about the time that Josiah dies, actually, he dies tragically in battle, that the Assyrian Empire, the bad guys, the bully on the block for the last several hundred years falls apart pretty quickly. Around the year 609, and a new power emerges, and it's going to be the Babylonian Empire that comes to power, that sweeps in, that conquers the Assyrians, and suddenly the Babylonians are in power. And their king is a very famous king whose name is Nebuchadnezzar. I will make every effort not to make you spell his name on a future test for fear of the variety of spellings that I would get. Nebuchadnezzar is this Babylonian general and king, and he quickly wants to exert his power and control. Because when Assyria falls and Babylon takes over, all of these areas that Assyria had controlled suddenly want to rebel, and they don't want to pay attention to the Babylonians. And so Nebuchadnezzar needs to go around and exert his authority and say, you're under our rule now. And among those was this little nation of Judah. The king at the time decides, we're not going to pay attention to the Babylonians. What could happen? Well, what happens, it takes a little bit of time, but Babylon eventually shows up in Judah. The year's 597 BCE. The Babylonians conquer the surrounding territories. They surround Jerusalem, and the king decides to wave the white flag. He decides to surrender rather than get attacked and potentially get killed. He surrenders to the Babylonians. We made a huge mistake. We will pay you off. Just don't destroy our city. And so Nebuchadnezzar, apparently very, very forgiving kind, says, here's your one chance. But tell you what I'm going to do, Mr. King, you're coming with me, and we're going to take about 10,000 of your best citizens, and you're all going back to Babylon. We want to benefit from your expertise, from your knowledge, but we also want to take sort of the leading citizens out of Judah, figuring that if we just sort of leave other people behind and take sort of the brain trust with us, maybe there'll be less problems among those who stay behind. And so here in 597, the period that we call the exile begins. The beginning of the Babylonian exile. As things fall down in Jerusalem, and as we head into exile, 597, we imagine this situation, 10,000 people sort of arrested, if you will, deported by the Babylonians. We're taking you back to Babylonia. There's going to be cities and towns for you to live in, but you're coming with us for now. And so into exile we go. And I've sort of alluded to this, but we know historically that this was the policy of the Babylonians. When they went into an area and they took control, they exerted their authority, they would take the best, the leading citizens, however they determined that, and they took them back to Babylon with them, Babylon being modern-day Iraq. We'll flash a map here in just a second. When Babylon took you away, if you were among the exiles, you weren't forced into some sort of camp, but you were taken back into these cities. There were neighborhoods that you helped to build. and you could live together. You can even worship your own God, but you're going to do all of that while you're in Babylon. And so there was a sense in which intellectually, economically, Babylon is going to benefit from having the best of this conquered people come and live among us. Because if they're really among the best, they're going to settle down, they're going to want to make a living, they're going to want to find a way to provide for their family, they're going to start businesses, they're going to do those sorts of things, and Babylon's going to reap the reward for that sort of thing. And if we've got the best citizens over here in Babylon with us, maybe it's harder for the people back in Judah to rebel because they're just going to be disorganized, people have been taken away. I think ideally that's what they were hoping for. Well, so here in 597, 10,000 citizens and the king taken to Babylon. Among them was a priest. His name was Ezekiel. Ezekiel, we'll see his name in a minute. Ezekiel. From a priestly family, had done priestly sorts of things while in Jerusalem. But what's a priest to do if you're forced to live in Babylon? Because the life of the priest was built around the temple. And whatever sacrifices and rituals were happening at the time, Ezekiel would have been one of those leading. But in Babylon, we don't have a temple. We don't have those sorts of things. And so what's an out-of-work priest supposed to do living in exile? Well, God's plan for Ezekiel was to call him to be a prophet. Ezekiel, I've got some things you need to share to the people that you are in exile with, because they don't understand what's happening. And so God wants to speak to these people now living in Babylon, and Ezekiel is going to be given the task of leading those sorts of conversations. And Ezekiel's like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do this. And God says, I'm going to give you the words to speak. And Ezekiel symbolically, we think, has some sort of vision where God gives him a scroll, and Ezekiel eats the scroll, eats the paper, says it tastes like honey, sweet going down, God's words. And so this sort of symbolizes that God's going to give Ezekiel the words to speak to the people in exile. Well, just to sort of get our bearings here, you see on this very simple map, the trek that people would have had to take, our 10,000 citizens, going from Jerusalem to Babylonia, back over to sort of the home base of the Empire of Babylon. So we have to go up, sort of up and around, because, you could go straight across from Jerusalem to Babylon, but you're going across the desert the whole way, and it's difficult, if not impassable. And so to go up and around, you're sort of following the curve of the Fertile Crescent. You're staying on major roads. You've got access to water, those sorts of things, as you make your way back over to Babylon. Roughly, as the crow flies, it's about, 500 kilometers, 300 miles or so. I'm in Charlotte. I think it's 300 miles to Richmond, Virginia, 300-ish miles down to Savannah, Georgia, just in terms of trying to get a bearing on how far it is that we're talking about, being on foot the whole way. This is a trek. This is a long way. This is not just, oh, we're going to take you 20 miles up the road. No, we're going to take you far away from what you know, from what's comfortable. You're living in a new place. You are a minority. There are people being conquered and captured from other places who are also coming and being forced to live here. And so it's a melting pot. It's a mess for the Israelites as they try to adjust and get used to everything that's going on. Make our way across the desert with Ezekiel. The book of Ezekiel is interesting because it seems like there are messages really dedicated to two different time periods. And so what we're going to do here real briefly is to mention some of Ezekiel's early messages and save some of his later messages for a couple of class periods down the road. And I think it'll make more sense as we do this. So Ezekiel gets called to be a prophet, we think somewhere around the year 593. It seems like he's been in Babylon for a few years when God calls him to be a prophet. And so we've got exiles in Babylon. Ezekiel's among them, 10,000. But we've also got people back in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is still standing. There's still a temple. There's a king, sort of, a king who's been put in place by the Babylonians, supposed to keep Babylon happy, don't be stupid, don't do dumb things. And so in this sort of divided world, Ezekiel gets some messages from God. And apparently at the heart of it is the idea that the exiles who are living in Babylon thought, this is going to be quick. Apparently there were people going around spreading the message. This is just temporary. This is going to be really quick. Soon we're going to be back in Jerusalem and everything's going to be fine. This is just a little test. Everything's going to be fine. And Ezekiel is the voice, the contrary voice, if you will, as he declares messages from God that say, yeah, not so fast. You need to settle down. You need to plan to stay a while. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. We're not going home. In fact, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And Ezekiel is preaching these messages to this exiled community who don't believe him. And so Ezekiel very much is just this lone voice trying to help the exiles to see what's really going to happen. But if you remember when we introduced prophecy several class periods back, one of the things that we noted was, how do you know if a prophet is a true prophet or a false prophet? And oftentimes you don't know until after the fact. So here's Ezekiel saying, plan to stay a while, Judah's going to be destroyed. But the people don't believe him. They probably think he's crazy. They probably think he's a false prophet. He's delusional. There are other prophets running around saying everything's going to be fine. We're going to be going back soon. Well, how do you know which one to listen to? I mean, you probably want to listen to the one who says what you want to hear. But it's only after the fact that you realize that Ezekiel was actually the true prophet speaking on God's behalf. Well, Ezekiel's a little bit of a weirdo, if we can be honest. His book is strange at spots. He has visions, he has dreams, he does some peculiar sorts of things. He acts out some of his messages. Like, for example, let me give you just a few of sort of the smattering of examples from the early chapters in Ezekiel. On one occasion, Ezekiel gets out in front of the people, and we don't know exactly how this unfolded. I guess in my mind, I'm envisioning Ezekiel's out on the town square or something as he begins to act out this message in front of people who are gathered around. And on this day, he breaks out a clay tablet. So it's sort of a whiteboard, if you will, a portable whiteboard of his day, this clay tablet, and he takes some chalk and he begins to draw on the clay tablet, and he's drawing the city of Jerusalem. And hey, there's the temple, and there's the king's palace, and there's our old neighborhood, and there's the Chick-fil-A we used to visit. And he draws all this on the clay tablet, and then he sets it on the ground, and then he takes out what in my mind, now you need to remember that I'm pretty old here. I remember growing up with like little green plastic army men who could, you would do battle with them when you were like 6 years old or whatever. And in my mind, Ezekiel takes out like a bag of Babylonian plastic army guys who surround the city of Jerusalem that he's just drawn on the tablet, and they start bombing it and building ramps and invading, and the city gets conquered and destroyed. And Ezekiel's trying to tell the people, this is what it's going to be. This is how it's going to be. Jerusalem's going to be surrounded, and it's going to be destroyed by the Babylonians, and it's going to be bad. On another occasion, Ezekiel out in front of the people. Well, what's the crazy prophet doing today? Well, he's making a loaf of bread. And typically, in that culture, when you made a loaf of bread, you would gather your grain, you would gather your wheat, and you would grind the wheat berries into a powder, which form the basis of your flour, and then you add the other ingredients and cook it over a fire, and you have your bread. Well, on this occasion, Ezekiel has him some grain, some wheat that he crushes up, but it's not enough to make bread from his flour. And so he takes some dried beans and he crushes them up and adds it to the mix. And he has to take some other grains and crush them up and add them to the mix so that he gets enough flour to make his bread. But it's this mix of ingredients that no doubt the people were thinking, that's gross. Well, then he makes his loaf of bread, and instead of cooking it over a typical fire, we're told that Ezekiel takes some cow dung, a cow patty, if you will, lights it on fire, and proceeds to cook his loaf of bread over the pile of burning excrement. And the smoke is going up and no doubt working its way into the bread. This is a bad version of Subway sort of going on here as the odor bakes its way into the bread. Ezekiel, what are you doing? Well, Ezekiel's trying to show the people this is how bad it's going to be in Jerusalem. There's not going to be enough food. People are going to be desperate for food. They're going to be scrambling to do whatever they can in order to survive. And Ezekiel's trying to help the people in exile see how bad it's going to be in Jerusalem. You're not going home soon. It's going to get bad. People are going to be starving. People are going to be dying because of the situation that they're going to find themselves in. On another occasion, Ezekiel shaves his hair, shaves his head. Culturally, this meant that something bad had happened. Men only shaved their head when they were in a time of great grief. And so when you were grieved, you would shave your head. Otherwise, you didn't. And hair was important in that culture. And so it's striking that Ezekiel shaves his head. But then he takes about a third of his hair and he burns it in the fire. And he takes about a third of his hair and he chops it up with a sword. And he takes about a third of his hair and he goes out and he throws it up in the wind, and the wind blows and scatters it all over the place. But Ezekiel's taken just a few hairs, tucks them in his belt to save them. And folks come to Ezekiel and are like, "Hey, Ezekiel, we don't get it. What are you doing?" And Ezekiel's like, "That's what's going to happen to the people in Jerusalem. A third of them are going to be burned. They're going to die in fire and in the battle. Some are going to be chopped up and killed by the sword. Some are going to run for their lives, run for the hills. They're going to be scattered all over the place. But God's going to take a few and save them and save us through the process of exile. But it's going to be bad in Jerusalem." And then one last example of Ezekiel acting out his messages. Ezekiel had a little house that he lived in with his wife. Apparently, it was up against the city wall. And on one occasion, God has Ezekiel pack his bags and dig a hole through his house, through the wall of the city, and pretend to escape with his packed bags, digging a hole through the wall, acting like he's making a run for it. And Ezekiel's message is, this is going to be like the king back in Jerusalem. He's going to try to make a run for it. It's going to be so bad, he's going to try to escape destruction by fleeing. And I'm sure the people in Babylon, the Jews who are watching Ezekiel, are just like, this guy has lost his mind. What is he doing? What's next? I'm sure he's sort of a form of entertainment. Probably nobody taking him seriously, because we've got other prophets running around saying everything's going to be okay. Just hold on a little bit more. God's working everything out. And Ezekiel's saying, it's going to be bad. Well, Ezekiel also speaks some messages. Ezekiel shares about a vision that he has where God carries him back in the vision all the way down the road, 300 miles, back to Jerusalem. And as Ezekiel looks around, the people are still worshiping idols. The worship of Yahweh is nowhere to be found. Idol worship still predominates. And Ezekiel sees all of this by way of the vision and hears of God's displeasure. And this is why destruction is going to come. The people have not learned. The people are not relying on Yahweh. They are trusting their idols. This is going to lead to their destruction. Ezekiel has another vision that he shares with the people where he witnesses what he calls the glory of God. The glory of God leaving the temple in Jerusalem. When God came to dwell in the temple, way back in Solomon's day, when Solomon built the temple, the people saw, by way of a cloud, the glory of God coming in, descending on the temple as a symbol that God is with the people in the temple in Jerusalem. And here it's like we see the reverse of this. In this vision, God enables Ezekiel to see the cloud is leaving. The glory of God is rising up from the temple and heading east to Babylon. That's where God is going to be found, with God's people, not in the temple in Jerusalem. God has some very choice words for the false prophets who were running around. Apparently, there were still false prophets in Jerusalem saying Judah is not going to be destroyed. God is not going to let anything happen. This is God's holy city. This is God's temple. We are God's people, even though we're worshiping idols. God's not going to let anything happen to his people. And Ezekiel is declaring they are wrong. That is false. Destruction is coming. And there were prophets running around Babylon saying the same thing. And Ezekiel's just like, y'all don't know. Y'all don't know. And I guess at the heart of it is that those back in Jerusalem continued to forsake God. Yeah, they're worshiping other idols instead. They're prostituting themselves. Ezekiel comes back to that word that we've seen before. They're worshiping other gods. They're trying to make alliances with other nations to protect themselves against the Babylonians. And instead of seeing that God wants them to change, God wants them to repent, God wants them to see his care and his compassion for them, instead they've just turned their back and they're making these alliances and they're worshiping these other gods, and they're just failing to see who God really is in their midst. And we'll end here. Ezekiel very briefly tells us the story of the death of his wife. Ezekiel's wife dies. He mentions and is mentioned in the text. And God told Ezekiel, do not mourn for her. And this would have been against cultural expectations in that day and in that age, in that culture and community. When a loved one died, there were expressions of grief, public expressions of grief, tears and wailing and mourning and shaved heads. And God says none of that. You are not to mourn for her. And God says, here's why. Because my wife, Judah, was about to die too. And so once again, we see this instance where the prophet's life is living out a deeper reality, sort of as we saw with Hosea and Gomer. Ezekiel, your wife has died, my wife's about to die. And there's not going to be any mourning for her either. And at this point in the story, Ezekiel is told by God to stop. Ezekiel, I have nothing more to say through you. You are to be silent. And so Ezekiel enters into a period of silence. God God has nothing else to say. Almost like as if God is saying, I'm done talking. Nobody's listening. Nobody's paying attention. So we're just going to have to let it play out. And so I guess in the spirit of Ezekiel at this point, I should probably go silent as well. I won't end awkwardly quite like that, but Ezekiel trying desperately to help the exiles see what reality is, but they just can't see it. They can't envision life in a world apart from Jerusalem and the temple and a king in the line of David on the throne. It's what has been part of their story for hundreds of years. And Ezekiel, God through Ezekiel trying to help them see that there's a new reality coming. But for now, nothing else to say. And next time, we'll go back to Jerusalem and we'll connect with another prophet who's there during this time period. His name is Jeremiah. Jeremiah is trying to help the people in Jerusalem see what God is doing. He's not going to have much more success. But that's where we'll head next time.